The gospel lesson today is the same as last week. John 16, verses 20 through 24. I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. And so with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, you will no longer ask me anything. I tell you the truth, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now, you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. This is the reading of the word of our Lord. You may be seated. So a brief reminder of what we went through last week. The message today is entitled Good Grief, and we kind of started it last week. You may recall that I put Charlie Brown up there on the screen last week and introduced you to him and to Lucy. And then there was a frame there where Charlie Brown was kicking the football. You know that scenario? And as always, Lucy pulls the ball away just as he's about to kick it. And he goes flying. And what's his response? Good grief. We all know there's nothing good about grief, right? Except that Jesus actually says there is something good about grief. And so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that today. We have all kinds of griefs. When we think of grief, we most often think of loss, and particularly the loss of a loved one. Most of the grief groups that you've heard meet are responding to a couple of things. One is the loss of a loved one. The other is often the loss of a marriage. Yeah. Both of those things bring on a great amount of grief. And like you, I don't really find a whole lot of good in that. No, not even a little bit. But we have other kinds of griefs. We have griefs over frustrations. We have griefs over fears and hurts. We have griefs over different opinions. Sitting at the Thanksgiving table, why doesn't your family believe what you believe, right? Do you have some topics that are just, we don't go there? Yeah. Cool thing about that is you still love these people, but there is a kind of grief that you can't convince them what you have come to believe. We have griefs for different tastes, we have griefs for different hopes and different dreams, and all of that causes grief in one way or another. So just kind of a little bit of definition. Grief is the loss of normal. It's the loss of paradigm, what we have always, that lens that we look at things through. Suddenly the color of that lens changes and we grieve what we thought we saw before, what we thought we believed before. We grieve the loss of routine. We grieve the loss of comfort. Lots of different griefs. And then last week I introduced you to the great lie. Here's the great lie. If we do what we have always done, we will get what we have always gotten. Doesn't work that way. And I gave an example last week of being on pain medication. The longer you take pain medication, what do you find? the less it does for your pain. This is called the law of diminishing returns. And the reality is, if we do what we've always done, we get less and less and less. So, the devil's tool is comfort. And I like comfort as much as anybody, maybe even just a little bit more. I don't know. That chair calls my name, when I step into the house. And that's where I want to be. Comfort. But when we're comfortable, we're not always growing. We're not always accomplishing what God would have us do. And that brings us to the new material today. I invite you to see grief as God sees it, as good grief. And the first point I'd like to make is there is good grief in spiritual growth. There's good grief in spiritual growth. I told you a story one time, some of you may remember it, about the first Sunday that I was a pastor. That was a few years ago. But I remember being in the church on Sunday morning, and I did then what I do now. I try to greet each person as they came in, and of course I was learning names and going through the transition of becoming a pastor. And one of the people called out to me before the service started from the pews and said, "Pastor," and I started looking around to see where he was. It took me a minute to realize they were talking to me. And the thing that happened after that was I went through a period of grief. Now, it doesn't make sense, does it? That you would grieve the realization that you're a pastor. But the truth is, I had been on fire for the Lord for a while by then. I had talked to lots of people about my faith during that time. And you know what people did when I talked about God? They listened to me. They were interested. They were intrigued about how this young guy could possibly be excited about something you can't see, feel, hear, or taste, right? How do you get excited about that? And they wanted to hear about that. And I knew as soon as I became a pastor, when I realized that's who I was, that they wouldn't take me as seriously anymore, because now it was my job. It was my job to say those things. Of course you say those things, Chris, because that's your job. That's what you're paid to do. And I thought, wow, I've lost credibility. Because now I'm a pastor. It's a kind of grief. Now, God would call that good grief, because I had made the next step in my spiritual journey personally. And that's what he wants from all of us. And as each step we take, each step of spiritual growth, we leave behind the step before. And when we leave behind the step before, there's a sense of loss. There's a sense of longing. God calls that good grief. Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So, you've heard the thing that athletes are told, no pain, no... No pain, no gain. It brings on a kind of grief to go through that pain. When we talk about iron sharpening iron, they talked about two swords that they would slide together. And as these swords crossed each other, they would be abrasive to each other, and they would grind off a little bit of the iron that was on the sharpest point of the blade. And as it ground off that iron, the blade became sharper. So think about this. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. When we're grinding on each other, you think that's comfortable? I don't think that's comfortable. No. No, if you're grinding on me, I'm not comfortable. Now, that could lead to growth. And that's what God wants from us, growth. So, there's good grief and spiritual growth. And Jeremiah 9:7, I will refine them and test them, for what else can I do because of the sin of my people? Refining involves a very hot fire. And if you're going through the flames of a very hot fire, is that comfortable? No, and it brings on a kind of grief, a grief that God would call good grief, because in it we are growing. There's good grief and spiritual growth. And the second one is there is good grief in vision. Now, I want to tell you that vision is revelation, okay? So if you have a vision from God, He is revealing something to you. So this is a revelation from God. Acts 2:17, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. You know, I've been misreading this for 71 years, or at least as long as I've been reading. I don't know. I didn't really understand what this meant. Your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. When I retired, I suddenly realized how much more I was dreaming in my old age than I had before. And I thought of dreamers as the kind of person that's unreliable, right? If you're a dreamer in life, then you're really not accomplishing a whole lot. That's the way we think about dreamers, right? But that isn't what this passage means at all. I honestly thought that God provided revelation only to young people, because it says young men will see visions. That's revelation. I know what that is. And old men will dream dreams, because we're useless, right? Did you know dreams are one of the ways that God performs what? Revelation. Yeah, revelation. They're both forms of revelation. It doesn't mean that old people are useless. Thank you, Lord. Because sometimes you kind of feel that way, right? It means that He reveals to each of us in His own way. Dreams are another method of revelation. This is Acts 10, verses 9 through 20. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. Now, again, translation is tough, right? Translation is difficult. Trance could have been translated as what? Dream. Okay? He went into a trance. It could have been translated as dream, similar word in the Greek. So, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals as well as reptiles of the earth and birds of the air. And then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." Remember I told you one of the kinds of grief is shift of paradigm? And if you understand what paradigm is, it's pretty much the way you look at the world. It's the lens through which through which you see everything. And that lens is made up of all the experiences you've had, all the words ringing in your head from parents and former bosses and teachers. There's so many things that go into this paradigm through which you see the world. Peter saw the world as you don't eat anything impure or unclean. And the voice spoke to him a second time, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. Now this happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. And while Peter was wondering about the meaning of this vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon who was known as Peter, was staying there. And while Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you, so get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them. Now, Peter's vision contradicted everything he thought he knew about what was appropriate to eat, what was clean, what was unclean. It caused him a certain amount of anxiety hearing that, and it caused him a certain amount of what? Grief, right? Grief, yeah. Because he was trying to imagine, all these years, did I get it wrong? Is this really from God? Can you imagine the questions that went through his mind and the suffering that he endured as a result? Now, I'm really glad about this passage because without it, I don't get ham. I don't get pork roast, all these things that are really important to me. Yeah, I ate a breaded pork tenderloin sandwich yesterday, a little taste of home. Nobody's heard of them here. Ah, well. So, yeah, that caused some grief. But because it expanded Peter's understanding of what God wanted from him, it was good grief, kind of grief that God would call good. Number 3, there's good grief in faithfulness. Good grief in faithfulness. If you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, move from here to another place, and it shall move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Matthew 7:20. So here's the thing about God. He doesn't ask you to do the easy thing. God never asks you to do the thing that you would do anyway. All right? When God asks you to do something, he's asking you to step out of your comfort zone. He's asking you to do the hard thing. He's asking you to do the thing that you would normally avoid because it's expensive, it's hard, it's uncomfortable, you don't want to be there, their chair is more comfortable, God asks you to get out of your chair and do something hard. And if it's easy, it might not be God. If it's what you wanted to do anyway, it might not be God. Like the man who spoke to me and said he was leaving his wife and 2 children for another woman. And I said, huh? And he said, oh, it's just the next great adventure God's got in store for me. Yeah, I don't think that's God. If for heaven's sakes, if it's something you wanted to do anyway, it's not something that God asked you to do. If God asks you to do it, it's going to be hard. Yeah, you can depend on it. And it's going to take a certain amount of what? Faith. And when you step out of your comfort zone, what are you going to experience? Grief. And God would call it good grief. I tell you the truth, anyone who has faith in me will do what I have been doing. He will do even greater things than these because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name so that the Son will bring glory to the Father. So one of the things our passage said is we need to ask. Do you ask? Last year we had an emphasis on what? Prayer. That's, at least in part, that's asking. Make sure you ask. He commands us to ask. He doesn't suggest it. No. He doesn't say, it would be a really good idea. He commands us to ask for what we want. That's amazing. We need to ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't let anybody tell you that it's wrong to pray for what you want. It's not. God specifically said to do it. Pray for what you want. And why does he answer those prayers? That's the other thing that's in this passage. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Son will bring glory to the Father. Now, it may be tough on your ego to hear that he doesn't answer the prayers for you. No, that's never why God answers our prayers. He answers the prayers to glorify God. It's always that way. We're the beneficiaries, and I kind of like being there. But he didn't do it for Chris. He did it for God. To glorify God. In other words, one of the ways that we grow is that we see answers to our prayers. There's nothing more powerful than a fledgling Christian who says, well, I've tried everything else, maybe I'll pray about it. All right? And that's a new and a foreign and an unusual thing for him and her. And so they get down on their knees and they offer a prayer to God, and boom, something magical happens in their life. Only it's not magic. It's God. God does that. He'll answer that prayer when he won't answer another prayer. No, he doesn't answer every prayer. Just, that's the way it is. He'll answer that prayer so that the person's faith will grow. Yeah. To glorify God. So, there's good grief in spiritual growth. There's good grief in vision or revelation. There's good grief in faithfulness. And the last one is there is good grief in change. I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Most of us do not like change. That's one of the things we try to avoid. We want to keep everything the same. Because keeping things the same is what? Comfortable, right? It's comfortable. Those changes are hard on us. They bring all kinds of grief. But the change that comes with grief, or the grief that comes with change, God would call that good grief. And listen to this. Become like little children. Why would you become like a little child? What sense does that make? I'll tell you some of the most powerful prayers that I have ever heard in my life have been prayed by children. It's just unbelievable how powerful, because there's absolute innocence in the prayers of a child. Powerful. And like Charlie Brown, children don't give up. They'll try it again and again and again. And it doesn't matter how many times Charlie Brown ends up on his back and suffers that good grief. He's going to trust Lucy again. He's going to wind up and give it his most and possibly be disappointed. Children are vulnerable. Children are up for adventure. Children are ready to kick the ball again and again and again. And that tells me that one of the things we need is perseverance. Jack Canfield, does that name ring a bell to anybody? Jack Canfield. Jack Canfield is the kind of author, there's hundreds of authors, I suppose, in each of these books, of Chicken Soup for the Soul. Any of you read Chicken Soup for the Soul? When Jack Canfield had the idea for Chicken Soup for the Soul, he pitched his book to 130 publishers. 130 publishers. And the publisher said no one wants to read 100 inspirational stories. Each book has 100 inspirational stories in it. And they turned him down. And he went to another, and he went to another. Now, what do you think Jack Canfield felt when he got those rejection letters? Grief, right? Grief. God probably called it good grief, because the 130th publisher that after 100 publishers, his agent dropped him. Yeah, even he didn't want anything to do with him anymore. After 130, he eventually convinced a tiny publisher in Florida to publish his book. Now here's what happens when you don't give up. 250 different Chicken Soup for the Soul books have been published. How many do you own? I only own 4 or 5 probably. 250 different ones, and over 500 million copies have sold. But 129 publishers knew that it was going to fail, and they wouldn't take a chance on it. Charlie Brown, he just believed, no matter what, that this time he was going to send that ball flying. There's good in grief sometimes, and we need to find it. God bless.